Good morning, Prince of Peace, and whoever else is going to be watching this. Today's another daily devotion, and our devotion comes from Proverbs today, not Psalms. Thought I'd break it up here a little bit and read a proverb here. This is chapter 8, and starting at the 22nd verse. This is wisdom's call. The Lord brought me forth as the first of his works, before his deeds of old. I was appointed from eternity, from the beginning, before the world began. When there were no oceans, I was given birth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains were settled in place, before the hills, I was given birth. Before he made the earth or its fields, or any of the dust of the world, I was there when he set the heavens in place, when he marked out the horizon on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above and fixed securely the fountains of the deep, when he gave the sea its boundaries so that the waters would not overstep his command, and when he marked out the foundations of the earth. Then I was the craftsman at his side. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world, and delighting in mankind. So throughout the book of Proverbs, the first 9 chapters, roughly 8.5, there's this dialogue between wisdom and folly, and they are personified, right? There's no person wisdom or person folly, and they go back and forth and talk about how both of them are attractive. Both of them are things that people run after and listen to their call. When I was teaching at Concordia, I once had a student describe it as that folly was the girl you went out on dates with, but wisdom was the girl you took home to meet your mother, which I thought was hilarious and terrible. No, but you do kind of get that sense that folly's for having a good time, and wisdom is maybe the person you need to settle down with. So how Proverbs work is this is not law. And people take it as law, but because it's in the Old Testament, but it's really not. What it is good advice from somebody who's been around the block a few times, and it's mostly true most of the time. If you pick up any proverb and just run it around, you'll find that it's probably about 80% true. And that's part of Hebrew poetry and Hebrew, what are called his wisdom literature. So this is not a one-to-one correspondence with reality all the time, just because this runs like a parable, right? Nobody gets upset when Jesus tells parables and there isn't a guy sowing, an actual farmer out there in the field. So that's how this works. So for Proverbs, in this front section, devotionally, you kind of end up having to read bigger chunks. You can sit and mull over who wisdom is and who folly is, and whether you're running after which in your life. So that's fine. And then in the other half, or the other 2/3, I really should say, of Proverbs, you take it kind of proverb by proverb until you find one that you really need to chew on if you're going to look for a devotional approach to the book of Proverbs. So this is not one where you just get to run and read straight through all the way to the end and say, check it off your box as I read Proverbs this year. Okay, so the other thing that you can do, especially because this is a parable, is who does this sound like? This is wisdom talking. Who does this sound like? The Lord brought me forth at the first of his words, before his deeds of old. I was appointed from eternity, from the beginning, before the world began. There were no oceans when I was given birth, when there were no springs abounding with water. So this is all language that we would expect about Jesus, the second person of the Trinity. This shouldn't surprise anybody because in the Christmas or Advent hymn, O Come, Emmanuel, right, we actually sing about wisdom from on high. This is where we got that from. So it's a parable. So there's not one-to-one. But it sure sounds like Jesus, and it's something to think about. If you feel like doing some different devotional reading, there's a Really good. It's kind of short for theology. It's maybe like 2 pages, 3 pages long, and it's dense. But it's a really good article by Saint Athanasius called "On the Incarnation" or "De Incarnation," and it's fabulous. But most of Athanasius's arguments come from this little section here about begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, before whom all things were made. But it is Lent, at least it's Lent right now when I'm giving this, and one of the things that you can do is run through and look for Jesus in the Old Testament, right? This could be a fun Lenten sort of a deal, and where does he show up? Because we know that he shows up in Genesis chapter 3. We know that he shows up when he's talking to Abraham. We know that he shows up when he wrestles with Jacob all night. Those are fun stories, but here he is in Proverbs chapter 8. So devotionally here again, when we talk about this section and when we read through this section from verses 22 through 30, we have a few different devotional approaches that we can take. One is to stop at every single thing that he talks about was created, and we can turn and thank Jesus for its creation. Right, from John chapter 1, that we can, we hear, nothing that has been made was made without him, or all things were made through him. So there's a Father creates it through the Word sort of thing, and we usually talk about creation as being the domain of the Father, but the Son was there. The Son was there the entire time. And he delights just as much in the creation as the Father does, and probably more than we do. So that's one thing to do, is to kind of go through this list and cultivate a list of thankfulness to Jesus as the Word by which everything was created. The other thing that we can do is here in verse 31 and 32. Then I was the craftsman at his side. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence. I rejoiced in the whole world and delighted in mankind. Sometimes I get questions as a pastor as to what the Trinity do in amongst themselves, right? What's it like being part of the Trinity? And since we can't really even describe the Trinity without a whole bunch of is and not symbols, right? If you remember seeing the window or the diagram in confirmation or in adult instruction or whatever, if you go and look up, you'll see the symbol for the Trinity as we try to describe it. But what's it like to be inside of the Trinity, to have none be ruler but all be God? And you can go and again devotionally use this as a kind of spearhead or point to jump off into the Athanasian Creed. That could be interesting for today as well. But sometimes, you get what's it like to be Jesus up in heaven with God the Father, and what's their relationship like, and how does this work? Well, Proverbs 8, sorry, I almost said Psalm, I derailed myself. Proverbs 8:30 and 31 tells us in a parable sort of a way, if this is Jesus, the extent to which we're talking about the Son of God here gives us room to tentatively say some things about what the nature of the relationship between the Father and the Son is. Then I was the craftsman at his side. I was filled with delight day after day, rejoicing always in his presence, rejoicing in his whole world, and delighting in mankind. So the life of the Son, as he is joined with the Father and one, is a life of delighting in God's presence and delighting in creation, and especially the height of creation, humanity. This, of course, is pre-fall, but there's some things to think about, and especially for Lenten devotion and Lenten adoration here for the Son. That's what Jesus stepped down from, right? Philippians 2, he did not see equality with God as something to be grasped, but humbled himself, being born in the form of a servant. That's actually, this is what he left to go and do that. being at God's side, delighting in his presence, and rejoicing in and delighting in mankind and all of creation. So that's something very Lenten to contemplate and to realize the incarnation has bigger implications than just he's going to die for me, or he's here to heal the sick and proclaim freedom to the captives, all of that. But what did he leave? And a lot of the time we think about power. We think about omniscience and omnipotence and those kinds of categories. But something during Lent, especially as we ramp up the austerity in Lent toward Holy Week, to contemplate is he left rejoicing and delighting. And Isaiah will say that the Son of Man, or the Son of God, right, the Messiah is a man well acquainted with sorrows, right, a man of sorrows. And here it is. Why? Not just because we're crummy and mean to him and kind of slow on the uptake, but because this is what he left. So there's a Lenten kind of devotional thought for us. And then as well, if you want an application devotional thought, how are we doing either at rejoicing in God's presence during this Lenten time, and especially in coronavirus time? You have nothing but to do but sit at home and be in God's presence. Isn't this amazing? I know. So that's half of it. The other part to it is, am I actively giving God something to rejoice over, right? Am I being the good kid I should be? And I use those in quotes, right? But am I being the good kid I should be, or am I being a problem case? And does God need to come and speak to me as he speaks to small children? So those are some of the things that we can do as we interact with this lovely little piece of the book of Proverbs. I hope you have a wonderful day and that you continue to stay healthy.